Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. So, have you ever heard something like this? Procrastination is a trauma response. Self-absorption is a trauma response. Being rude is a trauma response. Well, I hope we're going to make sense of this for you today. I know this is something that I've been seeing on social media for a while. I haven't really had language for it, and I just had a conversation with Maria Baer, and she's been thinking a lot about this. She just wrote an amazing article entitled "Make Resilience Cool Again. A New Study Demonstrates Why Endless Personal Trauma Mining is Destructive, Not Restorative." Now, I want to just say from the beginning, nobody is saying trauma doesn't exist or that it shouldn't be something that's dealt with and talked about. But what Maria's really put her finger on is how we've almost pathologized everything. So I want to read just a paragraph from her article, and then I'll take you into this conversation with her because I think you're going to recognize this. She said, if we were to follow this thinking to a logical conclusion, I don't think we'd like where it leads. I shudder to imagine what else might be a trauma response and therefore not our fault and therefore totally acceptable and therefore deserving of accommodation and therefore helplessly chronic. Even many times people kind of taking these sort of diagnoses and making them part of their personality. And so she talks about this research that's been done lately on people who have had childhood trauma and how they have fared throughout their lives. I can't wait for you to hear all of this stuff. I think it is such an important conversation that we need to have about being resilient and the role of suffering. We talked about that. We talked biblically about the role of suffering in our lives as Christians and the good that can come of that. We covered so many things. We got deep. So I hope you really love this conversation with Maria Baer. This episode is brought to you by Summit Ministries. If you're anything like me, you want to equip your kids to have an unshakable faith in a very, very chaotic culture. Well, Summit is here to help you out with that. You can choose a 2-week experience in Georgia or Colorado, and you can go to summit.org/Alisa. Lock in your early bird price by March 31st, and you can also get $200 off by using my code Alisa24. So that's summit.org/Alisa. Use my code Alisa24. Well, Maria, welcome to the podcast. So glad you're here. For anyone unfamiliar with you, tell us who you are and what you do, and then we're going to get into this fire article that you wrote and just the implications, because I think this is a super big topic that I suspect many of our listeners recognize, but they don't have language for.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you calling it a fire article just gives me butterflies a little bit, so I might be kind of nervous, but thank you for that. Yes. So I'm Maria Baer. So I co-host the Breakpoint This Week podcast at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. If your listeners have heard from the Colson Center before, chances are somewhere my hands were involved in that. But I also do some freelance writing and reporting elsewhere. So I write some commentary for World News. I also contribute occasional news stories to The World and Everything in It, which is World's daily news podcast, which I think is one of the best podcasts out there. I also am occasionally published doing some news writing at Christianity Today. I've done some work at the Gospel Coalition, and then just some other like secular news publications. I used to write for the City magazine in Phoenix, where I used to live. So went to school for journalism, and I kind of have a heart for both kinds of writing, sort of Christian thought and philosophy, but also news as well and storytelling. And I feel really blessed that I get to kind of do both in my professional life. And then personally, I have 2 young daughters and my husband, and we live here in Ohio and are just having lots of fun.
That's awesome. Well, I'm
Yeah.
so glad that you are coming on the podcast today because we're going to be talking about resilience and trauma. In fact, the title of your article, and I just want to tell everybody listening to us and watching us, please go read this article. It's called "Make Resilience Cool Again. A New Study Demonstrates Why Endless Personal Trauma Mining is Destructive, not restorative. And so I think this article makes so much sense of a lot of what I'm seeing even in the deconstruction movement because I mean, I
Mhm.
believe trauma is a real thing, but trauma has
Totally.
almost come to mean almost anything, like any kind of
Mhm.
difficulty you might encounter in your life. And you have put your finger on something so important. So, what I'd love to start with is tell us about the study that you cite in this article, because I was so fascinated reading about this study because I think it really shines a light on how we can approach this topic.
Totally. I was fascinated by this as well, and I love that, people had the idea, to build a study like this. I thought it was so clever the way they put it together because they were, really looking at a problem that I'd been kind of thinking about for a long time. I'm sure you have too, like you said, kind of observing the deconstruction movement and also just larger cultural movements around mental health. All these questions were kind of swirling, and they kind of hit exactly, what I was wondering, which is how do people who have endured trauma fare into adulthood? And is there anything that we can glean from, who seem to do better and who seem to struggle more that could help us in our approach to trauma when it happens? And so what they did was this was out of King's College London, and then I think some researchers in New York as well. They found somewhere around, I want to say 1,200 survey respondents, and they looked over like a 15-year period. And a handful of these respondents had court records of having suffered what's usually called in the psychological community an adverse childhood experience. So some kind of childhood trauma that had was substantiated by court records, right? So this is neglect or abuse or sexual violence. It could have been maybe the death of a parent, being in the foster system, something that we know tends to cause trauma that reverberates as a child grows up. And so this was a subset of these survey respondents were chosen because those court records existed. The rest of the respondents did not have any official record of having suffered childhood trauma. Now, that of course doesn't mean that they didn't. There just wasn't a record. Either in both cases, the researchers did not tell the respondents that they were aware of these court records.
Hmm.
They essentially sat these folks down and said, "Tell me about your childhood and then tell me about your mental health now as an adult." And they found some really interesting things. Not everyone who had, court documented instances of adverse childhood experiences shared what those experiences were. So, they weren't aware that the researchers knew. And so some people chose to share those things and some people didn't. Some people who didn't have court records or documentation suggesting their trauma as a child shared stories of trauma. What they found was the people who did share stories of their trauma, whether these were substantiated or not, in their adulthood seemed to be struggling more than the others. So, more anxiety and more depression. Um, the most interesting result, I think, for me from this study was that there were 170 some people who had record of trauma as children who did not bring it up to the researchers. And those 170 some respondents were no more likely to be dealing with mental health issues in their adulthood, like anxiety and depression, as the general population.
Hmm.
And the conclusion was something that I had been, like suspicious of for a while. And you wonder. Their conclusion was that it's not necessarily the trauma itself that determines how you fare into adulthood or how your mental health develops over time. It's more about the meaning that you ascribe to it. Now, there's a ton of caveats here, right? Because there's trauma is a wide spectrum. In my opinion, I think it's actually gotten wider than it even needs to be. We call
Hmm.
too many things trauma,
Yeah.
but in the real definition of trauma, there is still a spectrum. There's levels of violence and trauma, and there's trauma that's ongoing and lasts over years, and there's one traumatic event. So there can be all kinds of different ways that people's minds cope and deal with it. And there's also people have different temperaments, people have different genetics, all sorts of things also contribute to our mental health as adults. But what I think is really helpful in a general way that we can take from this is that purposely dwelling on pain,
Mm.
not with the aim of, getting past it, learning to accept it, and learning to cope and live with it, but dwelling on it in the sense of thinking about it all the time, sort of incorporating it into your sense of self or your identity,
Mhm.
making sure that everyone around you knows about it and can accommodate you in the way that you think you need. It's actually not good for us. It does not. It
Yeah.
does the opposite of what we're hoping it will do, which is give us relief and help us to feel better. The opposite is actually true. Now, there is also um, a lot of research that suggests when you have suffered trauma or when you have, uh, any other sort of like clinical mental disorder, typically, confronting your fear and anxiety is empirically far and away the best way to deal with it. So the argument I'm making here is not like pretend this didn't happen and stuff it
Right,
down
right.
and never talk about it. The question is the motivation behind it and the time that you spend doing it, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
There's if you're talking about your pain and your trauma with the goal, like I said, of coping with it, accepting it, and moving forward, that's healthy. Um, but unfortunately, I think too many of us, um, in the wider culture as well, even outside of the psychological community, we're sort of imbibing this cultural waters which suggest you should just kind of dwell on it. And
Mhm.
and that's
And
not
you
good for
you
us.
well, that was very well explained, and you as you also said, almost make it your identity. It's almost
Mhm.
become the new pronouns to put your mental health
Yeah,
issue, in your introduction of yourself, right? And I think we see this
right.
I see this a lot among Gen Z in particular, and I think there
Mhm.
have been some studies by, I believe it was Barna and Impact 360 that discovered that on one hand, Gen Z is more aware of mental health issues than generations previous. But I am and, this wasn't really discussed in the research, but I wonder if maybe that can also have a negative side as we're seeing this kind of fragility among people, and a perfect example of this was, a friend of mine was doing a Q&A at a secular college campus, and a student got up to the mic. This was obviously somebody who was struggling with a lot of things, and they were very angry because this was an
Mhm.
apologist that was giving a presentation. And it got so heated that my friend just basically said, if I give you a book, will you read it?" And this student basically said, "Oh, I can't read books because I have ADHD. Do you have a Audible that I could read?" And my friend was like,
Mm.
"Well, I don't have I have a physical book I can give you. Well, will you read it if I give it to you?" And he's like, "Well, is there text to speech? Because I can't read books because I have eight." And this is a college student. This
Oh
is a
my
student that's
gosh.
in college
Wow.
that, and it's like, of course, I'm not denying that ADHD exists or that it can be difficult to read books, but is the answer to just
Mhm.
say, "I can't read books"? Or is the
Oh.
answer to try to overcome that and push through? And so I think that to me, that was so stunning that that was such an example of just this it's like this fragility about, and I'm not just harping on Gen Z. I think we see it everywhere, but are you seeing things like that? And how would you think through that? I mean, I know you posted a couple of Instagram posts that you'd seen that reflect this mentality.
Mhm. Yeah, I this has been a growing concern, I think, yeah, among Gen Z in particular, but I've seen it in my own life and my personal life and relationships as well. And I think I understand the impulse behind it, which is if you're feeling bad, right? So if you're suffering, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling sad, or some expectation of yours is not being met. Life just isn't what you thought it was going to be. You want to find an explanation for that. That's a totally human impulse, right? I share that impulse. And the more academic we get about mental health struggles, there are positive results of that. People are getting help that maybe wouldn't have gotten help 20 or 30 years ago. But I think the negative parts of it are that we start to pathologize just human problems or normal, maladaptive behaviors or honestly sin struggles.
Mhm.
And the we do that. I think the aim is to empower ourselves, to sort of to get away from the whole like, well, if you're sad or feeling depressed, just get up and go, feel better, I guess. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. And we find that really offensive and hard. And so the pendulum has now swung so far the other direction that we're saying everything that causes you discomfort or pain is probably explainable. And it's very important that we are able to explain it. And then I guess, I don't know, we shrug our shoulders and we make sure everybody around us knows so we can be accommodated. But the paradox is, I think that example you shared about the college student is perfect and really sad, because the paradox is that's the least empowering thing you can possibly do, because now the implication is it's not changeable. I
Hmm.
mean, I wish you want to ask that student, like, why would you accept, sort of that pronouncement,
Hmm.
over you that you books are no longer available to you anymore. Well, couldn't you
Hmm.
try?
Right.
And if you can't, and obviously you navigate one situation at a time, but to just make a pronouncement is really limiting. And unfortunately, that's the downside of this pendulum swing all the way to the other side, where everything is pathologized. I think I shared in the story about this goofy meme I see all the time that's like, procrastination is a trauma response.
Right.
And I'm thinking like, so what's the implication behind saying that? And I'm guessing, I'm just imagining like a horde of college students emailing their professors and saying like, I've just discovered that because I didn't turn my paper in on time, it's because I have trauma somewhere and I need to find out where it is and deal with it. And
Hmm.
also you need to accommodate my lateness and
Right.
all this kind of thing.
Right.
And all that happens is you don't learn that, let's say you do have really significant trauma and it makes it difficult for you to meet deadlines. Presumably, you still want to get along in the world and do
Hmm.
well and excel. Probably the route you want to go is to find how best you can cope with this and move forward, as
Hmm.
opposed to using it as an excuse. And I just find that really disempowering.
I don't know how many of you caught the State of the Union address, but I was sickened by our president's words about the pro life cause and his absolute insistence to stamp out our voices. Well, we can vote with our dollars. We can give our money to companies that are going to promote pro choice causes, but we also have the opportunity to place our money with companies that are going to advocate for the pro life cause. And this is why I love 7 Weeks Coffee. So, first of all, I love it because it's really, really good coffee, and I really like their business ethics. So they are pesticide free, mold free, shade grown, and they are direct trade, which means they pay their farmers 300% more than the standards that are required for fair trade. And I also think it's just the best tasting coffee I've ever had. I get my espresso beans from 7 Weeks Coffee every month. But here's the thing I really, really love about 7 Weeks, especially in light of recent comments, and that is that they give 10% of all their proceeds to pro life resource pregnancy centers all across the nation. To date, they've given over $300,000 to the pro life cause. They are dedicated Christians. They are unapologetically pro life. And when you buy their coffee, not only are you supporting this podcast, but you're also supporting the pro life cause, and you're getting amazing coffee in return. So go to 7weekscoffee.com. You can use my code Alisa for 10% off your purchase. Again, go to 7weekscoffee.com. Use my code Alisa. Hmm. Is this primarily a Western thing? Do you think that there's more mental health in the West than ever? Is that, real? Is that
Yeah.
imagined? And
No,
how did we
it's
get the,
Western.
yeah, okay, talk about that.
It's Western. And I've looked at this because this is the other part of this that fascinates me, because if you look at objective measures of like human well-being, Westerners are doing the best, right? We have the least poverty. We have the in most cases, I think we have the longest life expectancy. Um, we have the best, birth outcomes and childhood health outcomes. We have the most advanced health technology. By all of those kind of metrics, like materialist metrics, we're doing the best. But we absolutely have the most mental health diagnoses, I think, in the West compared with anywhere else in the
Mm,
world. Now, you could look at that and say, well, we just know how to diagnose it. right? We just have the knowledge that allows us, and certainly there's some truth to that, because obviously there are very real and very difficult mental disorders. I mean, things like schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression as well, anxiety disorders. These things are real and we do see manifestations of them all over the world. There's a lot of research about that. But there is definitely an increase in sort of the lower level diagnosing of, general anxiety disorder, attention deficit. I think you mentioned even things like OCD. There's way more of that in the West. I think, now I'm not a psychologist, so I'm armchair psychologizing this a little bit.
Hmm.
But from a philosophical point of view, I think the real driver of this is our expectations. I
Mm.
think
Mm.
when you become really comfortable and you're living in a time and place that's really advanced technologically like ours is, and is not only advanced but has advanced very quickly, which then gives us the impression that it's going to keep advancing as quickly as it is. Um, we have an expectation that life is going to be less and less difficult for us, and that it's going to be less and less painful. And that's both materially, but also emotionally. You see this in particularly left politics, that, we're always progressing towards
Hmm.
doing better culturally. We're going to be more equal. We're going to be kinder. We're going to be more inclusive. No one's going to feel bad ever. And I think the impact of our expectations on our life experience is probably, I think our expectations are the biggest, um, how do I want to put this? They are like the single most powerful tool in the way we experience our lives.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
and I think that explains the cultural differences. So in the West, if you expect your life to be wonderful and then you encounter pain,
Hmm.
now you not only have to deal with the pain itself, you have to deal with the shock and the sort of disillusionment of it. If
Hmm.
you're growing up in a culture that's very, very poor, that has always had to work very hard, that usually, maybe kids even have to work to support the family, and those things seem natural to you and are expected, then I think we have an easier time getting along mentally.
Yeah,
And
and I think
I
I
think
think
that's demonstrated. Yeah.
and even for Christians too, if you think about it, if you look at at church history, most Christians throughout church history have had to really suffer for what they believed. And I think here
Yes.
in the West, especially in America, where people debate over the exact faith of the founding fathers, that's fine. You can debate that, but you can't debate that these are theistic documents that presume that
Mhm.
humans are sinful. That's why there's separation of powers. They assume that there's these unalienable rights that are coming from a higher source, right? And so I think we've been able to coast because our expectation is that a biblical worldview is not that controversial until now, when it's like
Yeah.
becoming rapidly more controversial, and we're not strong. We're fragile about it. We're like, well, if
Mhm.
I say the truth, I'll lose my job, or if I speak truth, I might lose a few friends, or I might get kicked out of this group or something. And I'm just thinking, like, most Christians throughout history would be like, what are you even talking about? Of course you're going to lose your
Mhm.
job. Of course you're going to lose your family and your friends and all this. And which is one of the reasons the first century church was so kind of communal in their experiences. Like, if somebody became a Christian, they might be rejected from their entire community, and then the Christians
Yeah.
had to then take care of them. So as far as the Western idea goes, I want to read you something I wrote in my second book. This is my
Mm.
book, Live Your Truth and Other Lies, in the suffering section, because I think
Yes.
how we as Christians deal with suffering is so, so important. And I want to see what you think about this. But then I'm going to read you a different quote from a progressive Christian about suffering and get your thoughts.
Can't
So
wait. I'm
here's
ready.
what I wrote. It says, I told the story of my friend Maydeen, who was a refugee in Congo for 18 months, and it was this harrowing
Mhm.
ordeal. Then right after that, I say, it may seem shocking to those of us who eat 3 meals a day and have access to clean water, clothes, shoes, shelter, and bug spray, but until more modern times and the rise of Western civilization, life was pretty hard for everyone. Christians expected hardships. They assumed that even though this life was fraught with suffering, they had a God who walked with them in this world, offering a future, um, hope of bliss. Sorry, wait. Yes, a future hope of eternal bliss in the next. But something happened in recent history that tossed the narrative upside down. We got rich. We became affluent and confident. We no longer needed to depend on God every single second of every day because we had coats to keep us warm and cars to drive us to the jobs that earned us money to spend on groceries, clothes, and modern medicine. These are all good things. I'm thankful for them, especially modern medicine and the invention of anesthesia. Can we all just take a moment and thank the good Lord for anesthesia? But
Amen.
Amen. But there is a certain poverty that arises out of prosperity. We tend to forget the
Mhm.
real purpose of life, which is to enjoy, to worship God and enjoy Him forever. And so, the highest goal is not to make us super happy and comfy on earth. But I think because of our cultural moment, we've almost bought into the idea that that is what it is. So now I want to read this quote from a progressive Christian. Now, this is interesting. This was on Patheos, and the article was entitled How to Stop Talking Nonsense, the Myth of Redemptive Suffering. So, the myth of redemptive
Oh
suffering.
my. Okay,
Yes,
very
there's a
good.
lot even just in the title. But here's a quote.
Mhm.
He says, To say we can learn something from suffering is to give suffering too much value and meaning. Suffering does not transform. Suffering dehumanizes. Suffering is evil.
Oh my.
Yeah. What do you think about all that?
Okay.
One of my absolute favorite companies is Good Ranchers. I love them for so many different reasons. One of the reasons I love Good Ranchers it is that it is the absolute highest quality meat you can buy. We're talking beef, pork, wild caught seafood, better than organic chicken, no hormones, no antibiotics. Another thing I really love about Good Ranchers is that all of their meat is American grown, raised, and harvested. That means you are helping out local American farmers when you buy from Good Ranchers. I also love that it shows up at my door every month because I have a subscription. I use the Ranchers Classic box if you want to know a good place to start. But all of that beautiful meat is delivered to my door, ready to go into the freezer so that I don't have to think about what I'm going to make for dinner. It's very important to me as a mom to make sure that I've got dinner on the table and that at least a few nights a week we are gathered around the table to eat dinner. And Good Ranchers makes it so easy. I don't have to stress about what I'm going to make. I love that the chicken is better than organic. I love that the pork is heritage breed and mRNA vaccine free. In fact, Good Ranchers has taken a pledge to not allow the mRNA vaccine in their pork, which is now approved for the use in pigs in the US. So this is a great month to subscribe to Good Ranchers if you've been on the fence and you've been kind of thinking about it, but you weren't sure. This is a great month to subscribe because if you subscribe in the month of May, you're going to get a free 10-pound Easter ham. Guys, that is a $119 value. If you were to add that on to an existing box, it would cost you $119. And again, this is heritage breed, humanely raised, prime pork. So go to goodranchers.com, use my code Alisa to get that free Easter ham plus $25 off your first box. Again, that's goodranchers.com, use my code Alisa.
Oh man, I have so many thoughts. Suffering is evil is interesting. I'd have to think about that for a little bit because um my my gut response is it is because I know that that's not the way that God intended the world to be. He didn't intend for there to be suffering. At
For
the same
sure, a
time,
result of the fall, yeah.
yeah, yeah. At the same time, I know, I'm thinking of God telling Moses, or telling the Israelites, talking about Joseph's story and saying God, men meant it for evil and God meant it for good. And my pastor was talking about that story actually last week, and he said, it's not just like God redeemed it for good. God meant it for good.
Mm.
So God meant for that, horrible thing to happen to Joseph. So I'm not sure I'm quite ready to say suffering is evil. I guess maybe it's unnatural
Mm-hmm.
in terms of natural law that, it's not the way God designed things. What's really interesting is I would say I loved what you wrote, and you said in there, that we expect when you get rich, you start to expect things,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a testament to how adaptable people are to their circumstances and how quickly we adapt to things. I'm really thankful for Viktor Frankl's work. I'm not sure if you've read him, but he was a survivor of Auschwitz,
Mm.
and afterwards, he wrote um, "Man's Search for Meaning." He was not a theological believer, but he kind of viewed his time in Auschwitz as he viewed it from like a sociological researcher almost lens. And I mean, I don't think he had that posture when he was there. He was in incredible suffering, but when he got out, he had been a psychologist by training and kind of observed how different men in his case dealt with their circumstances. And he talked about, when you are deprived like that, even after coming from a relatively wealthy or well off situation, with three square meals, when you're suddenly deprived like that, after a while, he was fascinated to see people adapt to where even the tiniest thing would give them so much hope, right?
Mm,
So
mhm,
if they knew that, in 2 nights they're going to let everybody in these barracks gather and they're going to let one of the guys tell some jokes. It's like
mm,
that will
mhm,
that
mhm.
would keep us alive for 2
Sure.
days.
Yeah.
And that speaks to what both you and I are talking about when it comes to expectations and adaptation. Because I do want to say too, when we were talking earlier about mental health diagnoses being higher in the West, I take them seriously. I'm
Right.
not at all suggesting that the diagnoses are incorrect.
Right. Sure.
And part of that is because our suicide rate is truly alarmingly high. So
Mhm.
people are serious. They're not making up their suffering. I'm
Right.
sure some people are because, putting it in your bio online and all that is trendy. And so some people surely are, but a lot of people aren't. So
Right.
the issue isn't that we're faking the diagnoses or that we're over diagnosing, it's that we are struggling to cope.
Mm.
And I think it's because of our expectations, like you said.
Yeah. I'm thinking about COVID. So now the commentary I'm about to make does not apply to anyone who maybe lost a loved one. I'm not talking about people who truly
Mm.
suffered during COVID, but for many of us, everybody's freaking out about toilet paper and groceries. And first of all, I mean, yeah, I want toilet paper. I'm not going to die you're not going to die without toilet paper. And yet everyone acted like it's what are we going to do? And
Mhm.
even I'm just thinking all through COVID, most of us could just open our computers and have food and groceries dropped off on our doorstep. And I just struggled the whole time to understand. I mean, of course, there were other stressors like people maybe losing work and having financial difficulties, all of that, of
Mm.
course. But I mean, to consider that, you have Amazon drop off your groceries as suffering, I don't know. I just like it was such a disconnect for me. Even the toilet paper thing, like, and when everybody was panicking, like we were low on toilet paper, but I just started thinking, well, I've got some trees out back, we got some
Like,
leaves.
I'll figure this out.
We'll
People have
figure
figured
it'll
this
be
out.
okay. I mean, you won't die without toilet paper. But it was just like this kind of deep, almost like people were using the word trauma and all this. And I'm just like, this is so hard for me to wrap my head around. But I
Yeah.
wonder how much of this is because the church is not, well, I shouldn't say make such a broad statement, but I think studies have borne out that much of the church does not have a biblical worldview, even many pastors, which means we probably don't have a robust theology of suffering. So what does the Bible have to say about these topics, about suffering and how we should go about that as Christians?
Yeah, I think from, Genesis 3 on, the Bible treats suffering like an absolute given. It is not a shock at all. That's not to say that God doesn't have compassion for it. I think, the Psalms are some of my favorite parts of the Bible, in part because David is so dramatic.
Mhm.
And he's dramatic because he's feeling what he's feeling. He is in his feelings, Alisa.
Yeah,
And
he is.
in
He's
the
got the
Psalms, and I
feels, yeah.
appreciate it's honest. At the same time, and he's even honest, I think sometimes he and Job and others in the Bible are very honest about saying, like, "What but why did it have to be this way? And why did it have to
Yeah,
be me that is dealing with it like this?" And I think those are perfectly honest and normal and fair questions to ask God, because I'm sitting here with you right now talking about the reality of suffering. But if, something unimaginable happened to me or my family tomorrow, I'm going to be devastated and
of
angry,
course.
and
Yeah.
you know, I'm going to deal with all of that spectrum of emotion. So that's all legitimate. I just think that the Bible, the overall narrative of scripture and of the story of God creating people to be with him and enjoy him, people giving up that privilege through sin, and then God making a way for us to come back to him. Through that whole story, what becomes obvious is that human suffering in the world before Christ's return or before we die and go to be with him is not an emergency, and human comfort and happiness and the absence of suffering is not the highest good. It's probably not even in the top 5 list of things that we should aim for.
Mhm.
I think the Bible is also clear that Jesus cares deeply about human suffering and understands it. So every Lent, I read through all 4 Gospels, and I love reading through them quickly because it's
Mhm.
just a cool way to get the whole story, kind of from a bird's eye view, not obsessive over each little parable or verse, but just to read the story as it is. And one of the things that stands out is Jesus encountering people who are sick. And
Mm.
he knows that even the people he heals physically are still going to die. That was, during COVID, I kept thinking, I just want to write something that doesn't really even have any words in it other than a title. And the title is, You Realize You're Going to Die at Some Point, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah,
it's the
that's
most
good.
alarming. Like people are talking like they don't think they're ever going to die. Now, there's a lot of caveats there. I understand not wanting to
Sure.
die prematurely and not wanting to die of COVID. But anyway, when Jesus encounters people who are suffering, he cares about that, but not his it's not his main prerogative. And we know that because there are some people he encounters who have physical ailments. I'm thinking of the man who's lowered on the mat into his friend's house.
Mhm.
And what's the first thing he says to him? Your sins are forgiven.
Yeah.
And they're like, Pardon me? He can't walk. And he's like, "Okay, I want you to, believe and see that I'm the Messiah." And, God knew what was best for him to do in each individual situation, but then he healed him physically. And so, like I was saying, God knew that each person he encountered here was eventually going to die. So, him providing physical healing was not so much a fix of the fall as it was compassion, which
Mhm.
I think suggests that when we are suffering, whether it's physical or emotional or mental, God feels bad for us. And I don't mean that to sound trite because I think when we're suffering, we want people to feel bad for us. We want to feel like someone sees us and is also sad that we're feeling the way
Has
we're feeling.
compassion. Yeah.
Has compassion, exactly. But it also is very clear, both from Jesus' ministry and Paul's letters and everything that goes on in Acts and Revelation, that physical and temporal suffering in the world is really not an emergency.
Mhm.
It's not something we need to obsess over eliminating at scale.
Yeah. It's like in I believe it's James, consider it
Yeah.
pure joy when you
Yeah.
encounter trials of various kinds.
Mhm.
And it's hard to understand that as people who try to minimize suffering. And this is the thing I've been thinking a lot about too, because sometimes even in my own parenting, I realize I'm a lot more protective than my parents were. And I don't know what to
I
do
know.
about it. I mean, I see how I try to minimize my children's suffering, and I shouldn't, but I still do it. And I do see the results of it. Like, how did we get here? Because I don't wanna be
Mhm.
that way, but it's almost like, Maria, it's difficult to break out of that if you want to, because when I was a kid, we would go out and play, and we had to come home when the streetlights came on. That's a lot of people, that was kind of the universal signal, it's time to go home as the streetlights come on. And yet today, if I were to tell my kids to go outside and play, then people might call child services if they see a kid
Yeah.
playing all by themselves out on the street. So I know that there's a little bit of social pressure involved, but I also know that there are things that I'm doing. It's like, why am I doing this? So, Maria, why am I doing this?
I think this all the time. But let me ask you first, do you find that your parents are more safety conscious about your kids than they were about you?
Yes,
Right?
interesting. I do think
Oh
so.
my word, it drives me
Yes.
that drives me crazy because I've noticed the same thing about myself that I feel much more helicoptery than I think my parents were. But then I get frustrated because my parents are even more helicoptery about my own children, so their grandkids. And I'm like, I need you to help me relax here, and you're doing the opposite.
Yes, that's
I don't know what that is,
interesting.
if that's a grandparent thing or if that's a the
Yeah.
changing times kind of thing. But I don't know. I think I have I'm just gonna speak personally. I've really tried to be honest with myself about the fact that when I'm trying to avoid or eliminate my kids' suffering, a lot of the times I can't separate out my own self-protection in that because you're a mom. I can't imagine a deeper pain than my kids suffering and me having to
Yeah.
watch it,
Mhm.
right? So I recognize that part of this is my own defense mechanism. And I try to offer that up to the Lord and ask Him to help me determine when I am trying to protect myself in a way that is going to um, preclude my kids from learning lessons they need to learn, and when I'm being a parent that is being responsible and careful. And
Yeah.
in my own life, this is where I'm really grateful for my husband because I need a partner to deal with that with me because we
Mhm.
tend to have different ideas about what's safe and what's not safe and in what environment, and so we tend to balance each other out a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm really wrestling with this myself because so about 2 years ago, I was diagnosed myself with obsessive compulsive disorder, and I it is now extremely obvious to me that I've dealt with this my whole life. I just didn't have language for it. And the treatment for OCD, now I don't there's a couple different kinds of OCD, and there's a wide spectrum of it. I think a lot of people think of like the hand washing one.
Mhm.
That's not the kind that I have, but they're all related. The core of OCD suffering is basically like an inability to cope with feelings of uncertainty. So if you
Mm.
think of a person who has a germ phobia, they're trying to get as certain as they possibly can that
Interesting.
their hands are clean, that kind of thing. The therapy for OCD is exposure and response prevention therapy, and this is used for PTSD as well as some anxiety disorders. But essentially, it's like the worst form of therapy you can picture. It's like list all the things you're really scared of and then go do them
Go do them.
or
Yeah, right.
go risk them. And
Mhm.
this has been like a personal epiphany for me, especially the way I parent for this reason. So when my kids, when it seems like they are demonstrating anxiety about something or they're worried about something, if it's something healthy to be worried about, then yeah, let's have a conversation about it in an age appropriate way. If it's something that my daughter went on a field trip in first grade to the fire station and learned about fire safety. And then she came home and for a few nights, couldn't fall asleep because she was scared we were going to have a fire because that's what they talked about there. And my pre OCD self would have said something like, that we're not going to have a fire. Like, that's so unlikely. It's just not going to, giving her certainty, right?
Yeah.
Now that I'm in this therapy and I feel so bad for my kids because they're having to deal with this as well, I'm like, if there's a fire, we will do the best we can. I don't
Yeah.
think there will be, but there might
Yeah.
be. Just because I think even that subtle difference will hopefully help her cope better than I have in my life with that kind of uncertainty and fear. But I think it's just normal as a parent because, like I said, I don't ever want anything bad ever to
Mhm.
happen to my kids because it will be so painful to see that
Yeah.
and,
I learned
from
that
my
lesson
vantage.
I learned that lesson the
Yeah.
hard way when I was a kid. I had a lot of fears, and we were in Australia, and my mom
Mm,
always made it very, very clear that well, my mom was very safety oriented, so she would train us,
mhm.
like, how to handle every different situation to the point that I literally knew what to do if I fell into a lake with roller skates on. Like, this is how prepared my mother.
What would you do? What do you do?
You calmly and slowly
Calmly. Okay.
untie your laces. Don't panic and
Oh,
don't try to kick up to the top. Just slowly untie,
oh my word.
take the skates off, leave them in the lake, and swim up to the top. See, I
Oh,
know what to do.
Alisa. Okay, to a hammer, everything's a nail, but I'm pretty sure your mom had OCD. Like, that's so
I think that
cute
maybe
and
well, that's interesting, the fire thing, though, because I did learn
yeah.
this the hard way. Because we were in Australia, we were staying in a hotel, and my mom had always prepared us, you never wanna stay above the 2nd floor in a hotel because if there's a fire, the elevators may not work, and then the stairs will be difficult, so we were in this hotel, but we were on, like, the 23rd or 4th floor because that was the only room they had, and I was like, "But
Uh-oh.
mom, what if there's a fire? What if there's a fire?" She goes, "There's not gonna be a fire." I'm like, "But what if there is? What are we gonna do?" She's like, "Look, I promise there will not be a fire."
Oh,
And then at two
no.
o'clock in the morning, the fire alarms
No.
start going off. They're evacuating everybody. Now, it turns out it was fine. It was just like a little kitchen thing. It didn't spread anywhere. But I was so distressed, I broke out in full body hives. So I
Oh,
always
Elise, that's so sad. How
no,
did
but
your
it's
mom react?
oh, she felt so bad, of course, and we
Oh,
joke about it
yeah.
now, but
Right.
she told me though, and this is what I love about my parents, is they always admitted when they were wrong, and they would
Yeah.
course correct and do that in front of
Yeah.
us and to us. So my mom even told me, she goes, "You know what? I should not have made that promise. What I should have said
Mhm.
is that anything is possible. It is very unlikely that that would happen, but if it
Mhm.
did, we would it's kinda like what you said, we will deal with it." And
Yeah.
I vividly
Mhm.
remember her being sorry that she had said that, and I thought
Sweet.
that was a great, parenting call on her part. But because of that,
Yeah.
I always, as a parent, would tell my kids, like, "Well, is this gonna happen?" I mean, probably not, but if it is, we'll be fine. We'll figure it out, and
Mhm.
if we're not fine,
Yeah.
then we'll figure that out too. And I've
Mhm.
tried to do that, but that's so funny that you would bring up that fire example.
The fire thing. Well, of course, like I mean, she came home and was saying, "I can't sleep because I keep picturing a fire," and I'm telling my husband, "Aaron, she has OCD. What are we gonna do?"
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
he's like, "No, I'm pretty sure this is just common being a kid stuff,"
Yeah,
and I'm
yeah,
and I'm
right.
but
That's interesting.
what a sweet way for your mom to kind of use that for you,
Yeah. I mean,
to
what are
help
the
you
chances,
learn.
right?
'Cause I think the problem is, I was thinking about this for some reason recently when we were talking about do you remember a couple years ago, like, Dr. Seuss speaking you weren't allowed to read Dr. Seuss for
Yeah,
a
it
few
was
weeks in
canceled
school
for a
because
minute,
he
yeah,
was racist or something, yeah.
yeah.
Because my first thought with that was because 'cause they're talking about I was reading Dr. Seuss to my kids then. These are, kindergarten age kids. You have to teach a kid that young to be that fragile about stuff like
Mm,
that,
mm,
and what a cruel thing to do to a person because,
mm,
if we, extended the analogy and we said something like, "There will never be a fire. Don't worry about it and don't ask me about it." The implication behind what you're saying is if there is one, I have no idea what to do, and neither do you. And I'm pretty
mm,
sure we wouldn't survive it. But if you have the confidence to be like, hey, something difficult might happen. You might come across something in a book, or you might read something about an author later in your life that makes you sad or it is not good. And, but you can absolutely handle that. I mean, I'm
yeah,
not worried at all for you about that. It's when the grown-ups in your life start to act like they're scared for you
mm,
about something that doesn't warrant that fear, you start to believe it. You can't help but catch that fear. That's where that adaptation piece comes in.
yeah,
And it's sort of becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you teach yourself that you can never hear things that, don't jive with what you believe, you can never see things that might trouble you, you can't hear opposing views, then you're essentially teaching yourself that you are extraordinarily fragile,
mm,
and the end result is you are going to actually become that fragile,
mm.
and that's unfortunate.
Wow, so how can we teach ourselves and our kids to suffer well? I mean, you've touched on it by just acknowledging that something bad could happen. Talk a
Mhm.
little more about that.
I think, one of the things I one of the other parts of this that I see happening across culture, but in a lot of the younger generations, but also in my generation is I think we do a little bit too much, like, internal interrogation. This is again the pendulum swinging, like, it's very trendy now, the whole mindfulness, meditation kind of space. And I think part of that is, like I said, the pendulum switching. My parents were not of a generation that talked about how they were feeling emotionally.
Mhm,
And I think some of that was very unhealthy. But I think we've taken it a little too far in the other direction because the
mm,
more time you spend interrogating how you feel from
mhm,
moment to moment, um, I think the study that we mentioned at the top of our conversation is evidence that that can veer into a really unhealthy place.
mm,
So I think knowing yourself is good. There's biblical instruction for knowing yourself, for taking thoughts captive, for, orienting yourself towards walking in the ways of the Lord. I
mhm,
was just reading Psalm 25. Teach me your ways, show me your path so that I can walk in truth. I mean, so we're supposed to be intentional about where our minds are and where our feet are going. At the same time, how you're feeling from moment to moment is not as important as we act like it is, I think sometimes. And so, I think just getting out of your own head, which is easier said than done,
Yeah.
but and doing the same with our kids, not constantly interrogating how they're feeling, and also not allowing their feeling to dictate how we respond to them. I read
Mm.
this really fascinating book a couple months ago by this Dutch sociologist, and it was called Between Us. And she was studying how emotions differ across cultures. And I didn't agree with all of her conclusions, but one of the fascinating things she found was that there are there the conventional wisdom in this kind of research has been that there are a handful of innate human emotions that everyone across time and culture have experienced, but maybe we just express them differently or talk about them differently. But she actually found that your circumstances can also influence your inner experiences. And she gave this example of, let's say you have a child who is in the grocery store with his mom. He asks for a treat. She says no, and he throws a fit.
Mhm.
And if the mom, says, "Oh my gosh, here's your treat," or if the mom says, "Okay, we have to leave because you're being so loud." Those are two options. The third option is for the mom to say, "Stop it right now," and
Mm.
to, do that. Now, the first time she says that, as any mom knows, that's probably not going to work, and
Yeah,
it might
be
not
too
work for several
effective. Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
But eventually, most children grow out of throwing tantrums. And what researchers have found when it comes to emotions is that not only are kids in this example, and then you can extrapolate this, not only are they learning to modulate their behavior, but they actually get less angry. That's the
Mm.
important insight there, which is that we actually have more control over our inner experiences and our behavior than we are taught.
Mm.
And, Alisa, I think about this all of the time when we talk about transgenderism, because
Mm.
you'll hear people say, um, if we don't allow, kids or people to do this to their bodies, to have these surgeries, to take these hormones, they will kill themselves. They will commit suicide. They will self harm. And that is a kind of devastating, like, white flag that we have no business waving, because
Mm.
you can you can tell someone who is deeply, profoundly struggling mentally and emotionally, don't hurt yourself. And you can
Right.
help that person get to a place where they won't. Nothing is inevitable. Our
Mhm.
behaviors are not inevitable. You get to decide what you wanna do. I mean, there's one of the core tenets of this OCD therapy is living according to your values, by which they mean, okay, let's say you're really, really afraid of germs. You don't wanna go out in public because you're afraid you'll touch germs. Do you still wanna work? Do you
Mhm.
want to function? Do you wanna go outside? Then you're just gonna have to do it.
Yeah.
And the blessing of it is the more you do it, it teaches that lizard part of your brain that panics that it doesn't need to panic anymore, and it stops. I mean,
Yeah.
there's data. Like, this
Wow.
happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So as we kind of come to a close here, obviously you mentioned transgenderism. We're in a really chaotic time in our culture. How do you think developing resilience for ourselves and our kids can maybe help solve some of this chaos?
Well, I think if we can get behind the root of the problem and help with our kids and our own expectations of life. This is where reading the scriptures, reading the stories of the saints, like you brought up, the
Hmm.
early church, and the way even the way modern Christians in countries like China and India and Myanmar and these places under really strict persecution, the way that they are bearing up underneath it. Um, if we can change expectations and we can make it seem like less of an emergency when we encounter disappointment, discouragement, moderate danger, pain, if we can sort of, as parents, if we can grit our teeth and let our kids experience those things, within obviously certain limits, and help them through them, but not try to protect them from all of those, um, then I think the psychological community hopefully can get back to its roots of treating the mind as opposed to treating the body in service to
Mm,
the mind.
mm.
'Cause that's not how
Yeah,
reality works, and it's
right.
not gonna help anybody. Um, but I think it's gonna require more and more of that because unfortunately, when it comes to things like sexuality in particular and gender, the more we go down this path, we're just gonna have more and more, victims of this,
Mhm.
and eventually it's gonna turn back over, and we're gonna realize that this never helped anybody, and
Yeah.
telling people that, this sort of safetyism and, never encountering or learning how to cope with difficult sensations or feelings or ideas is what you need. The more we can, squash that message, the healthier we'll get. And I think we'll have to.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I don't see the lawsuits are already starting when it comes to that sort of thing.
Oh,
And
yeah. We're
and
seeing all the
I'm really
detransition
hopeful.
stories and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So and I think the church has a this is where the church can shine because we're
Mhm.
not afraid of suffering. We shouldn't be afraid of dying. No, I'm afraid of I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of dying because I don't like to be uncomfortable and encounter pain. I
Yeah.
I feel totally comfortable saying that. At the same time, I know that our future glory will not compare with whatever suffering we encounter here. I know that Jesus encountered more suffering than I will, and he remained faithful to the gospel and to his Father, and that's really all I need to know.
Yeah.
I still, struggle and feel sad and anxious sometimes. And I think that's going to be a part of life until we get to be with him. But it's not an emergency, and we were made with the ability to cope with it alongside
Yeah.
him.
Very good. Where can people
Yeah.
connect with you online? I know you mentioned a few places you've written, but you've got the podcast over there at the Colson Center. So give us all that
Mhm.
info.
Yes. So if you search the word breakpoint wherever you get your podcast, then you'll find the Breakpoint podcast. The way it works is 5 days a week, John, my boss, shares a little like 5-minute cultural commentary. And then every Friday evening, he and I put out an hour long kind of conversation about news and Christian thought. So you can find me there. You can also find that at breakpoint.org. You can also I have a website, it's mariaebaer.com. So Baer is spelled Baer, mariaebaer.com, and you can find links there to wherever I've been published recently. I'm on Twitter, but I'm actually off Twitter for Lent, so you can find me there. It's Maria Baer Writes. So maybe this will be airing after Easter and I'll be back on there, but
Okay.
even if it's before then, you can find me there and I'll find you after Easter. So Maria Baer Writes, Writes is my
Great.
handle over there.
All right. Well, I want to thank my guest, Maria Baer. What a fascinating conversation. I hope this has helped you give language to maybe some of the things you've been seeing online. I want to invite you to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Click that bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. And it always helps for you to share this out on various social media platforms and get that algorithm working in our favor. And as always, as we pursue Christ, let's remember to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.